coffee, big cup, and hello. Welcome back for another episode of the Gilmore Way podcast. This is number 6 already of at least 107. So make sure you stay tuned and hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss a single one between now and November 2025.
This week we're talking about the complex generational dynamics at play within the show and how certain toxic patterns can end up repeating themselves when they go unrecognized and unaddressed. And you can really see these almost unconscious behaviors pop up multiple times during these episodes, most clearly when Emily confronts Lorelai about parenting, but also when she projects her fears onto Rory about going down the same inappropriate path that Lorelai did. And it takes what should have been a beautiful moment of bonding and turns that entire event into a battleground for old fights. We're going to have a lot to talk about this one. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we just want to also remind you that this is a spoiler-heavy podcast. We are talking about anything and everything within the context of this show, all 7 seasons and the revival. So if you haven't seen it and you're worried about being spoiled, go watch the show. Easy enough. But that being said, let's get into our episode recaps before we dive into our topic this week.
All right. Season 1, Episode 9 is Rory's Dance. Rory has a school dance coming up and asks Dean to accompany her. He agrees, and Lorelai makes a beautiful dress for Rory to wear. On the night of the dance, Emily shows up to see Rory all dolled up for her first formal and discovers that Lorelai has a back spasm, so she volunteers to stay with her and help her with what she needs. I've had multiple back spasms. They're no joke. They end up bonding a little again when Emily tries to make her mashed banana on toast, something she says she used to do when young Lorelai was sick. They watch a movie and both fall asleep in the living room. Meanwhile, in Hartford, Rory has a nice evening with Dean, but Paris and Tristan cause some drama. Paris brings her cousin as a date, and he asks Rory to dance, which causes Paris to melt down in front of everyone. And Tristan and Dean get into a bit of a scuffle, so Rory and Dean leave early. They grab some coffee and take a walk through Stars Hollow and agree that they are boyfriend and girlfriend. They notice the door to Miss Patty's is open, so they go inside to look around and end up falling asleep. Not rousing until Patty's 5:30 a.m. yoga class wakes them up. Emily drifted off in a chair at Lorelai's and wakes up first and frantically tells Lorelai that Rory didn't come home. A huge fight breaks out. Lorelai stands up for Rory, and she says she trusts her, but once Emily is gone, she fights with Rory too.
This is followed up by episode 10, Forgiveness and Stuff, and we get the fallout of the fights over this slip-up by Rory, and it leaves some lingering tension for the Gilmore family. Dean shows up at the Gilmore household while Rory is in Hartford, and he reassures Lorelai that nothing happened and that he needs her not to hate him. Lorelai is unceremoniously and uninvited from the Gilmore's Christmas party, but she heads to Luke's to get her mind off it, and he makes her this disgusting-looking Santa burger. But it's the thought that counts. While there, she receives a frantic message from Rory that Richard is in the hospital, so Luke shuts down the diner, drives her to the hospital in Hartford, where they find out it was luckily only angina. But the fear of possibly losing Richard allows the gang to forgive, move on, and grow a little bit closer as a family.
Yeah, I mean, this show is all about those full circle moments. Like, it's right there, baked into the theme song, where you lead, I will follow. Like, there's so much talk of generational curses in the show, and it's just woven through everything. So I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation, and I think 1 hour and 30 minutes is not enough. I think several hours is not enough considering how foundational it is to this show. So we're probably going to miss a lot of stuff, and we're probably going to come up with things after the fact and be like, oh man, why didn't I talk about that? I know I will. That happens to me basically every week. So we'll probably have to talk about some things at a later date. So if you think we've forgotten something, don't worry. It'll probably show up later. But that said, drop us a comment if anything comes to you that didn't come to us.
Yeah. That's perfect. Leave us a comment. We'll touch on it. Everything's going to come up. We literally have this plan for the next 3 years. So if we miss something, remind us and we'll get to it.
Like I said, November 2025. Strap in. We're going.
Yeah.
Where we lead, you follow.
Yes, that's the plan. With this one, though, I think there's no better place than to kick off this conversation and get us started than with talking about the reigning Lorelai. And by the reigning Lorelai, I think that we need to really kick this off with talking about Trix.
Yeah, she's kind of where all this starts, I think. At least from the characters we get through the run of the show. This probably goes back to the Mayflower, if we're being real. But yeah, she is obviously the eldest Gilmore that we see depicted. And oh boy, is she just written so obviously to be representative of that sort of like generational trickle down of these bad parenting strategies and just totally emotionally lacking and insensitive parenting methods.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's quite a character. First and foremost, I'll give a shout out to the actress Marion Ross, who just killed it, who just murdered and destroyed that role, for lack of a better way of putting it. But what a person and a face on screen where I abhorred her almost immediately as a maternal grandmother figure. And you see the residual effects of what she passes on to Emily as a a daughter-in-law figure, and how that plays and trickles down into Lorelai and Rory. But gotta applaud the acting. That's a matriarch.
Totally. I love her. She's just so like so cold. And it's funny because Marion Ross is so warm in real life and just so sweet. You know, she goes from Mrs. C to Mrs. Gilmore, and I'm like, you got range, girl. You got range. So yeah, props to Marion Ross. Yeah, you really see, like you said, it trickles. You know, I guess we could start with Richard, because you see it, but it's a little bit less impactful through Richard. But he's very much a mama's boy.
You literally took the word right out of my head.
It's not like I live there rent free. So
all the time. But yeah, go on.
He is very much so emotionally immature. He just sort of like dotes on her and doesn't see the toxicity of her behavior. He ignores Emily's pleas against her. It just sort of like goes over his head that what she does is completely inappropriate and insensitive.
Yeah.
And it makes him insensitive as well. He never learned how to deal with things. He was just taught, like Lorelai says it in the car in Forgiveness and stuff, you know, my dad just lived the way he thought he was supposed to live. You know, he got a good job. He provided for his family, bought his daughter a Barbie doll every so often, or, you know, whatever it was she said there. But that's not enough to be a good parent. And so it definitely makes you wonder what Charles and the original Lorelai instilled in him, that he is just still so out of touch with his own emotions, sometimes out of touch with reality and good sense. Yeah, he's just, you can still see he's immature.
Yeah. I think of the moment that we get in That'll Do Pig when Trix indicates that she is going to be making a move to Connecticut and taking up permanent residence there. And Emily's just immediately just like, oh no, like this is going to be a disaster of what I have to deal with. But Richard's response is, why didn't you tell me that you were ill? Why didn't you tell me there was something going on? And that really spoke to me in the sense of Trix has made sure that Richard's worldview was entirely hers, essentially, while she's in the picture, where it's not about Emily, it's not about your daughter, it's not about your granddaughter. If I'm here, it's all about me. And Richard just tunnel visions in on her and her well-being. And that's really, I don't know how else to put it. That's really toxic parental behavior, to just have your child be so focused in on you that they can't even factor in other familial responsibilities that they have. But Richard does it. And I don't think it's his fault. It's not something that I think he's even fully aware that he's doing, but his mother has ingrained that in him so much to just make it in his mind where it's like, it's all about mom.
Yeah, you can tell every time she visits the Gilmore house, all attention is on her. It has to be her way or the highway. She criticizes Emily's every move. Like, remember the time that she calls multiple times to make sure that like there's hand soap in the guest bathroom, and you know that their towels are Egyptian cotton, and she brings her own mattress to the house. Like, she is so finicky about stuff and so unwilling to trust Emily. And she just comes in and takes over, which is a hallmark of a emotionally insensitive, narcissistic parent.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, you make an excellent point there about the tunnel vision. She has to be the center of attention at all times. And she just has no flexibility in her thinking about the way anyone else does things.
Mm-hmm. Now, what do you think about not only how she interacts with Richard, but how she interacts with Emily and with Lorelai and Rory? Because I feel like she's within all of the Gilmore women interacting with them in completely different ways.
Yeah. See, her interactions with Emily is where it really gets juicy. We don't ever meet Emily's parents. We know nothing about her past. I think it's clear that maybe she grew up in a well-to-do household and still had a lot of those high society expectations put on her in similar ways to Richard, I'm sure. So she's not completely new to this milieu of these social expectations. But we still don't know much beyond that. But based on her interactions with Trix, my guess would be that she grew up in a household with a mom a lot like Trix,
Mm-hmm.
where she was probably emotionally neglected, if not, probably not physically neglected. She probably had all of her needs met and was used to a certain level of comfort and wealth. But my guess is that like her parents were also very distant or non-communicative and just completely shunned any sort of connection or intimacy with her, because you can see her almost regress when she's with Trix, where she goes from being this powerful woman in her own right to being almost childlike and needing to please Richard's mommy.
Mm-hmm.
She is just
Yeah.
so like she falls apart when Trix is there. Remember when Trix shows up and she's unexpected with the birthday party and Emily just
Yes.
freezes and is like, she has this anxiety reaction
Mm-hmm.
and her mind just starts spinning. Like, yeah, it's like regressive to her own childhood where parental figures cause this anxiety response.
Yeah, I could see Emily being raised to be essentially groomed to one day just be the perfect wife and the perfect like household spouse where the man's going to go to work, you're going to be at home making dinner, not that she ever does that because they have enough money that they can just hire help and they do, but her role in this show has always just been to be that sort of like trophy and presentable wife that's planning the parties, doing all of the household chores like upkeep and just facilitating all of the social engagements that Richard has to have. I think that probably does stem from her childhood, where that's probably how her parents lived their life. And her mother probably instilled in her this concept of one day you're going to marry this nice man. He's going to make a lot of money. You're going to be his wife and do all of these things that we just mentioned. And that's going to be your role. And that's what she always tries to fill. And it's not great. And thankfully, Lorelai was able to break the mold and get away from that, but Emily was not.
Yeah, it was definitely that role compliance and that role coercion. So like she felt that she had to fulfill it and she tried to instill the same things in Lorelai, but like you said, it didn't really work. But going to the second part of your question, in terms of how she interacts with Lorelai and Rory, the interesting thing that I found from reviewing Tricks was she clearly doesn't like Emily to the point that she will do anything to insult her.
Yes.
And so one thing I noticed was they were having dinner with Richard and Lorelai. I can't remember if Rory was there, but Trix was complimenting Richard on starting up his own new business after he retired. And then she compliments Lorelai in a similar fashion of like, oh, like I applaud that you are a hard worker and that's what makes women strong. You know, I have a lot of respect for people who work hard. And I think that was an underhanded dig at Emily, for one, because
Mm-hmm.
despite her own role as mostly a housewife, I'm guessing, and a philanthropist, I don't think Trix respects Emily in the same way. And I don't know why there's such a double standard for Lorelai, but it's something I think it was meant to be a dig at Emily, where she's like, you don't work hard, Richard works hard for you. But also, she's willing to praise Lorelai, who broke the mold and is not complying with the rules, in order to, again, indirectly put Emily down by saying, like, oh, Emily, you should have convinced Richard to start a business a long time ago, you know? It's this very strange dynamic where Emily is always caught in the middle. And again, it's one of those things that happen where emotionally immature people will play favorites.
Yeah. I mean, she, like you said, she does applaud Lorelai for becoming successful and becoming manager of this inn. And she even asks, like, is this a hard job? And Lorelai's like, yes. And she's like, good. A woman should work hard. And it's like, I don't think you're complimenting your granddaughter. Again, I think you're calling it correctly here. You're taking a dig at Emily, but you don't expect her to work hard. You expect her to be there for Richard. So now you're holding her to this double standard where she's never going to be successful or optimal in your eyes. And with instituting that in Emily, she's always just going to be feeling this sense of failure where I can never please my mother-in-law. No matter what I do, nothing will ever be satisfactory to her. And that's so detrimental. And Richard doesn't realize it, never corrects it. And Emily's just left to deal with it and compound all of that residual failure.
Yeah, going back to Richard a little bit, it's interesting. In Face Off, after Lorelai outs Trix and her man in the tracksuit, I don't know what else to call him. You know, her lover?
Both apply.
Yeah. And you know, we actually have this nice moment, the first and really only nice moment, sort of, between Trix and Emily, where this is possibly one of the first, it's not quite the first genuine apology we get out of Emily, but it's one of the few out of the whole series where she actually says, you know, I'm sorry. I know you have your pride. I should not have said these things in front of your friends. But I'm lonely too. You know, I can relate to you. My husband's gone a lot. My children are out of the home. Well, child is out of the home. And, you know, we have a lot more in common than you think. And your actions hurt me. She finally stood up to her and expressed herself in a healthy way that she had been lacking to this point, really. So that was a lovely scene. But then the next scene is Richard sitting on the couch with Lorelai, and Lorelai's trying to have this nice moment with her dad where she's like, you know, cut mom a little bit of slack. She's home alone all day, and grandma's really awful to her sometimes. And, you know, this is just kind of unfortunate that it happened. And then Richard just starts maniacally laughing and has this kind of weird, immature response to it where he's like, I guess I have a new daddy. Instead of using it as a moment to reflect on how awful his mother is to his wife and how he could have been supporting his wife better over the years, and how this could be an opportunity for him to bridge the gap between them. He just laughs and thinks it's funny.
Yeah, because Richard has always been an emotionally unavailable spouse, and that translated into him being an emotionally unavailable parent. And a lot of the time, too, I think he's also an emotionally unavailable grandparent. He does a little bit better with Rory in that regard in terms of picking up when she's struggling. But overall, Richard was never really in touch with his emotions in the way that he should have been. And I've got to blame Trix for that. You didn't instill any sort of confidence or emotional vulnerability in him where he feels like he can express any of those things. So as a husband, as a father and a grandfather, he falls short. And that's not his fault. It's Trix's and what she's essentially imbued him with in terms of this is how you should conduct yourself.
Yeah. And then we also have the Rory issue, which is when they say that Rory wants to go to Harvard. And she says, but you're a Yale man. Your father was a Yale man. And then Lorelai says, well, we want Rory to decide what kind of man she wants to be, which is a great line. But it also goes back to Trix's, you know, kind of ideas of legacy and the Gilmore name and those being the most important things over the actual individuality and happiness and, you know, self-differentiation of the members of her family. Any thoughts further on that?
No, I think you've touched on it well enough. I just think that there's such an installation in terms of what is regarded as acceptable and proper behavior and what's not, and it just gets passed down from generation to generation. And it's not really even corrected, I think, or even I don't even think it starts to be corrected until Lorelai. But even then, the apple doesn't always fall far from the tree, and she picks up a lot of Emily and Richard's toxic behaviors that she passes on to onto Rory, and she tries to break that mold. But there are still even so many moments when she's exactly like her parents. So it's just hard. But we see again that trickle down effect that is just always there. And spoiler alert, when Rory eventually ends up having her own child, I would have loved to have seen, and if we ever get a revival, I hope to see, like, are those behaviors still there, or has Rory broken the mold? I don't know.
Yeah, part of me does want to see that successive breaking of the mold where, eventually Emily found a way to sort of break out from under Trix, and Lorelai broke away from Emily. Lorelai and Rory have been so enmeshed in their relationship, and Lorelai has made a bunch of mistakes too. Rory reveres her mother so much, and I would just find it a shame if she maintained that and didn't sort of break away and do her own thing and sort of like make a successive step toward being even better than her mom was. But we'll talk a little bit more about that sort of like near the end when we get to that. But that's kind of why I wanted to start with Trix and see it sort of like loosening over the generations, which is what you want to see. You want to see patterns recognized and reversed before damage is done to a successive generation. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit too. But before we do that, I do have to give a shout out to stupid naked angel butts.
Yes. Yes.
This is a serious podcast and we talk serious things here, like stupid naked angel butts. Yeah. And dog statues. I need the hat rack. The fish flies at night.
we take our conversations here very seriously. Very seriously. Yes. There's no joking to be had.
Yes.
But yes.
No humor here.
Nope. No, every once in a while we'll shout out things like that. But yeah. I concur.
Yeah.
Honorable mention.
Let's talk about the scene in the third Lorelai when Trix has offered to give Rory her trust fund early. And Emily tries to convince Lorelai that Rory getting her hands on that money will somehow impact their relationship. And Rory will want to leave sooner. She won't need Lorelai anymore. And that, like, I think it's one of those scenes where you see Emily just really freaking out to the point of her actually revealing her true feelings, but in a way that's not conducive to actually making anything better. This is where you really start to see her concern for losing her daughter. That's where so much of her pain comes from, and her desire to control Lorelai comes out of that fear of losing her. And so now she's trying to manipulate Lorelai into thinking that she's going to lose Rory in the same way. So any thoughts on that?
She has always exerted this control over Lorelai that just stems from monetary control, where I'm going to fund you, I'm going to finance you in everything that you do from childhood up until the point that you leave. And even when she eventually gives Rory and Lorelai the money for Chilton, it's just a way for her to re-exert that control. And so when Trix comes in and she says, oh, I'm going to let Rory have the trust fund money early, Emily's really thinking of herself in that moment. And it's very self-centered of her, because she's just thinking, I've worked, or at least I've started to regain having my daughter and my granddaughter in my life. Now, all of a sudden, I'm going to lose them again because they're not going to need my money because they'll have my mother-in-law's money. So I think that she is, especially for Rory, started to like care about them a little bit more and want to invest in their lives a little bit more. But I think it's also just, you're losing the control that you have over your daughter and your granddaughter. And when you can't maintain that claw and that hold over them anymore, you panic and that anxiety kicks in. But that's not because you're genuinely caring about them. It's just because you're losing that sense of control. And that's really, really just narcissistic to me, to just think that this is just a control factor for you, and almost if nothing more.
Yeah. And this is another instance where we see inappropriate behavior from Richard and a lack of recognition of exactly what his grandmother is doing, or sorry, his mother is doing. And, you know, Emily goes to him and basically gets hysterical and is like, you need to stop this. You need to tell her to rescind this offer. And he says, if I do that, I'll be insulting her and I will not do that. And
Mm-hmm.
then she finally explains to him, like, I don't care if she demeans me and looks down on me. I don't care if she thinks I've tarnished the Gilmore name. I don't care if she thinks I'm the whore of Babylon. But like, I've given up on any hope of getting into her psychotic good graces, but I won't let her get away with this.
Mm-hmm.
And still, just right over Richard's head. He does nothing about it. He's like, all right, I'm out. Peace. Bye. Not going to do what you asked me to because, I can't go against mommy.
No, never. Because I feel like Trix, I wouldn't even put it past her to like almost sort of financially excommunicate Richard if he doesn't do what exactly she wants him to do. And so when you're holding even over your own flesh and blood child and Richard in this sense, just if you're saying like do what I want you to do and maintain the household and the familial relationships that I want you to have, otherwise I'll cut you off too. I don't even think Richard realizes that he could potentially be in danger of losing that, but that's just the influence and manipulation and hold that Trix has over everyone else in this family. And that's really horrendous and scary to see.
Yeah. I mean, Richard is now independently wealthy, but back in the day, his mother used to hold the purse strings for sure. And she does bring up in a moment of conflict a past indiscretion where he made a bad investment and she had to bail him out. But he paid her
Mm-hmm.
back quickly. And, you can see her willingness to use the past as a weapon and to use anything really to prove her superiority and to exert control or influence over everyone.
Yep. And when Trix doesn't get her way, I'll go back to like That'll Do Pig, where she's even so controlling over how dinner is going to be served and the amount of time like that you have to eat each particular course. And she just says like, tell your chef I want each one brought out 12 minutes apart. And if anyone is needing more time, then I guess we'll wait. But that's how I want it done. And it's one of my, I think, almost favorite moments throughout the entire show where Emily, just to spite her, is just like, I'm gonna eat my green beans like at a snail's pace, and she's just like,
Yeah, she makes a single green bean last like 30 minutes.
and Trix is like, fine, we'll wait. And like you could just
passive
see her
aggressive queen.
you could just see her stewing, but like it's such a like just a comedically great scene. But it's just Emily recognizing like, I'm gonna win this one here. Like you may win the war, but I'm gonna win this particular battle. And it's just a moment that I love, that I felt I wanted to bring up. So
Yeah, That'll Do Pig is very heavy on the tricks, and it really kind of brings together all of her worst tendencies. One more thing about that episode that stands out to me is when Emily comes over to Lorelai's house and is extremely judgmental of her furniture and her decor. And she comes in and she's like, she's going to come in here and take one look at this junk store collection of hobo furniture and she's going to blame me. Like you can see the deflection and the blaming and the criticism. And again, it's not even Emily's house. And she's like, she's going to blame me that I didn't send you out of town so I could redecorate,
Yep.
just these paranoid issues of just wanting to avoid any conflict with this woman because it's so pervasive in their relationship that Trix will literally find anything, even if it's not Emily's fault, and make it her fault somehow. So, and it's again kind of a common thing for emotionally immature parents to do is to come in and try to like control their children's lives. And so you see Trix controlling Emily and then Emily controlling Lorelai.
Mm-hmm.
Which,
yeah.
Yeah. I think that's maybe a good segue.
Yeah, I was about to say, I don't think there's anything else about Trix. We can probably move on from now, how the trickle down and how Emily starts treating her daughter and her granddaughter.
Yeah. I was just trying to move us along because I think we've been talking about this for about 30 minutes. Because Trix is good like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I guess coming out of this exact same scene that I forgot about, I think it might be an interesting segue where Lorelai is trying to give Emily a piece of advice about developing a coping mechanism against Gran. And
Mm-hmm.
she's like, you have to change your mindset. You have to like do what I do. And I decided that instead of being hurt and upset by your disapproval, I'm going to be amused. I'm going to find it
Mm-hmm.
funny. I'm going to take pleasure in it. And sometimes I'm going to even encourage it just for a laugh, just to like get a rise out of you. And then that's where we get the green bean scene.
Yep.
So, any thoughts on, Lorelai's coping mechanisms that you see her employing with Emily? Like, because that's
They're
not
all
the
just
only one. Do you see
they're all
any
just
others?
Yeah, they're all just emotional safeguards because at the end of the day, if you can't laugh it off like that and you can't find humor in it, you're just going to let it debilitate you and it's going to strain your relationship. So I can absolutely understand what she's doing. But Lorelai has a lot of really similar moments too, where Emily may be criticizing her home, her furniture choices, her outfit choices, how she is choosing to parent Rory, and calling upon more failures than successes. And I think Lorelai kind of just has to put up this emotional wall sometimes where she's like, I can't let you tear me down in the way that you are honestly trying to, because if I let you, like, you will win this. So I see a lot of that similar behavior too, where Emily's trying to safeguard herself against just being so beholden to Trix and her emotional takedown, that Lorelai does the same in a lot of ways. Rory not so much, but Lorelai definitely has to put up that wall to safeguard her against Emily. But are you thinking of there any specific moments where you see that happening?
Well, I mean, I feel like they're sprinkled throughout the show, and sometimes it's hard to remember all 7 seasons of like all those little moments because some of them are extremely subtle, and you only know to look for them once you've sort of started digging into this and have gained a better understanding of some of the psychological things at play here. But there's definitely actually, there's at least like 2 or 3 other sort of like strategies I see her employ with Emily. And those are like avoidance and lying are the big
Mm-hmm.
ones. And delaying as well. So, like, we see her delay in telling Emily about her engagement to Max. We see her lie about even small things, like whether or not she reads her Chilton newsletter. And
Yeah.
obviously the avoidance is clear. She tries to avoid her mom's phone calls and will try to get out of dinner at any cost most of the time. So, these are sort of additional mechanisms that she tries to employ to maintain that distance between her and her mom.
Yeah. I I don't have it pulled up immediately to call upon, but you make me think of that moment when she goes to Emily's house to finally confront her over why she's not happy over her and Max's engagement. And she just goes storming into her mother and just says, why can't you be happy for me? Why, when I tell you that I'm engaged and I'm due to be married, can you not like find any semblance of happiness or encouragement to give me? Like, don't you realize how much that hurts me and how much that actually affects me? And I think it really paralleled the moment that Emily had with Trix, where Trix is telling her, and Emily and her are having that conversation of like, yes, sometimes I can be lonely too, but you have to know that your words can really cut deep. And that was a very, like, in the same way that Trix and Emily had that moment, Emily and Lorelai have that moment of just both indicating to one another, like, your words can hurt. And when you're not there for me in an emotional capacity that I need you to be or that I expect you to be, it can really affect me and bother me. And so I think all women in both scenarios had to reckon with the fact that like you you don't know the damage that you're doing sometimes to people when it's not being emotionally available, and when your words or your lack of actions are really affecting your own flesh and blood.
Yeah, and I love that scene. And I think of the end of that episode where Lorelai goes and tries to repair the relationship after kind of sitting with it for a little while and reflecting on it. And she calmly explains her feelings. And it's really nice to see her kind of step up like that and try to bridge that gap by at least expressing on this issue what's going on. And she says, like, sometimes I don't know how to talk to you. Like, if you haven't noticed, we don't communicate very well. I'm afraid that if I'm happy, you're going to say something that will make me upset. Like, whatever I'm happy about will not be good enough for you. And if if something bad happens, I'm afraid that you'll say I told you so. So, Lorelai feels like she's in this no-win situation with a mother for whom nothing is good enough. And I think that's part of why she's so gentle on Rory most of the time, where it's like, you will always be good enough to me. She tries to provide the unconditional love that she never got. And then again, there are problems with unconditional love as well, and unconditional praise, which we see kind of in Rory. It's an overcorrection. She went too far in the other direction and didn't maybe offer quite enough specific emotional guidance and support to her own daughter because she was so starved for it in her childhood.
Speaking a little bit about that, it's a very common thing where people see Rory being Emily's daughter in the way that Lorelai was never her daughter, and kind of just having all of her hopes and her wishes for what she had for Lorelai then kind of placed onto Rory, since her daughter never lived up, so to say, to those expectations that she had. What do you think about that idea of just Rory being Emily's daughter in the way that Lorelai never was? How she has those expectations for Rory. Is it good? Is it bad? Do you think that's an accurate assessment?
Oh, I definitely think it's an accurate assessment, and I would lean towards saying it's bad. She's definitely displacing her emotional hurts from her parenting of Lorelai onto Rory, and trying to assimilate her into a role that she was never meant for. There's a very different relationship between a parent and child and a grandparent and grandchild. And so to try to, jump a generation because they didn't live up to their expectations is really toxic, because she never stopped to think that there was a problem with her approach. And she just tried to do the exact same thing to Rory that she did to Lorelai, without ever stopping to think that, hey, I lost Lorelai. It's not just a matter of like a mismatch on our personality part, but maybe it's a fundamental problem with what I'm doing here, with my behaviors. She never considered that, because people who are immature are often unable to self-reflect in that way. They're always externalizing the blame for things. And so Emily is constantly blaming Lorelai for the breakdown in their relationship, for Lorelai never living up to her expectations. That's all on Lorelai. And that's not the way to approach that. But anyone who doesn't know how to look within themselves for their role in what's happened is going to be unable to recognize the mistakes that were made. And they're always going to think it's the other person. So I think it was bad for her to try to treat Rory exactly the same when she knew that there was some fundamental error in the past, and just to assume that it could be corrected by trying harder at the same thing.
But it's also telling too that Emily never considered the failure or the fault to be her own. She always just displaced it onto Lorelai and said, my daughter failed because she didn't do enough. She didn't do X, Y, Z, because we gave her everything. And she has so many moments throughout the show, but there are times when she says, we sent you to the best schools. We invested in your future in the best way that we knew how. We were always trying to just be there for you and support you. And I think Emily believes that in her heart to be true, but there wasn't the emotional investment that Lorelai needed. And that's where Emily fell short, couldn't realize that she had failed in that regard, and just blamed Lorelai for it, and then for running away and needing to be out of that environment and out of that toxic household. Emily couldn't absorb any of that blame or recognize her own failure, and she needed to. And it goes into what we see with her and how she interacts with Rory too, where she's just then thinking Rory's Lorelai 2.0, I can do better here, but are you still emotionally investing in the way that you need to be? Or are you still holding these really toxic expectations on Rory too and not being there for her in the way that she needs? I think only minutely does she do better, but Emily's also always in the mindset of it's never me, it's other people doing wrong, and I'm not at fault.
Yeah. I know I sort of like gave a stab at Emily's childhood earlier, and I'm going to do the same for Lorelai now. I think when Lorelai was young, Emily was emotionally unavailable to her. Like she may
Mm-hmm.
have been there in physical presence and may have cared for Lorelai's physical needs. Like we get the anecdote um, in Rory's dance about the mashed banana on toast and how she would care for her when she was sick. But you know, there's a difference between caring for the physical needs of a child and the emotional needs of a child. And so when you're not willing to be vulnerable and emotionally connected to a child on a deeper level and like really be sensitive to their full range of needs, there's going to be stuff that they pick up on when they're younger about feeling like their parents aren't really there for them, that their parents don't understand. And so they tend to, well, I think what Lorelai did was she internalized that. And because no one was there for her, she felt like she had to step up for herself and become really independent, like fiercely independent, very
Mm-hmm.
young and very quickly. She didn't realize that this sort of like premature independence and maturity was more of like a necessity than just like a personality feature. It
Yes,
sort of came out
exactly.
of her mom being around but not ever really like caring what Lorelai felt on a daily basis. And so I think that's part of why she sort of wanted to skip ahead to the adult stage of life and why she rebelled so young, why she decided to become sexually active so young, why she decided to leave home at 17 to try to make it on her own as a mother. And it's why she had trouble throughout a lot of her life accepting real support from people and why she was always so like just emotionally detached, and she could never really like throw herself into something emotionally really until Luke came along, because Luke was the only one who sort of like understood it and gave room for her to do her thing instead of smothering her with their emotions.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And I think not only was she not able to do it with her parents, but she was never able to do it with Christopher. And this
Mm.
is a sexual partner and a boyfriend that you had in your life. And that's a very significant role and a very significant thing because you do end up getting pregnant. This ends up being the father of your child, but she could not even emotionally connect with him in the way that she needed to. And at the end of the day, I mean, Strobe and Francine definitely are to be blamed a lot for why Rory never had a father figure growing up. But it was also Rory Lorelai just recognizing too, I need to just get away from my parents, but I also need to break away from Christopher and I need to apparently raise this child on my own because I have no emotional support or connection with anybody, not even my child's father. So I'm going to have to do this alone. And it's unfortunate that Rory grows up without a father figure because I think she really would have benefited from it. I think she really needed it. She seeks it out later in life and she tries to just bridge something with Christopher. Again, spoiler, just a moment where after she finds out that after she knows that she's pregnant, I think she goes to him in the revival saying, like, do you ever regret not being here for me or a part of Lorelai's life? And I think that Rory was questioning that of him because she knew that she was pregnant and wanting to know, like, what's the importance of a father figure? Do you have regrets about that? So yeah, just I think Lorelai should have and needed to connect with Christopher too, but she was never able to. And the fact that she never had emotional connections with anybody really hurt her in life. And again, I think you make an excellent point. It was really only until Luke that she even started to have any semblance of that.
Yeah, the scene that sticks out for me on this front all the time is in the Incredible Sinking Lorelai's, when she's come back from dinner and she's supposed to meet Luke to have a business meeting for him to ask him for money to help get to the finish line on the inn. And she goes off on this whole rant about, how there are very few times in her life where she finds herself thinking she wishes she was married, and that, like, when she legitimately wants someone to be there for her all the time to pick up the slack that she can't always do. Like, she's shut herself off to everyone to the point where it's funny because she finds herself dependent on a lot of people. Luke does a lot of stuff for her around the house. People around town can pick up slack for her here and there, and she, you know, chalks it up to it just being like a really great community that does stuff for her. But she doesn't recognize like how much she actually counts on that. And so she sees herself as so independent that she has to do everything herself.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously it catches up to her when she figures out that she can't. And it's just, she always thought that she never needed anyone and that she was enough. She would figure everything out on her own. But she's gone so long without help and support from a partner, which is, a very different kind of relationship than friends or the community. And, she ignores some of her own social and human needs, including partnership and love and real intimacy instead of just codependency and enmeshment.
Mm-hmm. I mean, how do you think that we can skip ahead here unless you have something else to say, but how do you think then that translates into Lorelai's behavior with Rory? Because I feel like she's still making a lot of the same mistakes with her daughter that Emily made with her, and the lack of emotional connection and just reliance on other people. Do you think there's that same codependency? Do you think there's a little more independence?
It's hard to say. I think Lorelai avoids quite a few of the mistakes that her mom made, and she is more connected to Rory than Emily was to her. But I think there's a difference in the kind of connection that they have, and some of that actually sort of like crosses boundaries, and it's still more like codependency than true, like, just true connection.
Yeah, I think that Emily definitely had a lot of expectations for Lorelai in terms of, even from a childhood perspective, like, you're going to go to cotillions and you're going to go to dances and you're going to, have your social engagements be formulated out in this way. And, you should go to those things. And Lorelai doesn't necessarily have that crossover with Rory in terms of instilling like the same societal expectations, but Emily still does with Rory. And I think to the moment when Rory has her Chilton formal coming up, and I think that's maybe something good to transition us to here, where Rory is initially hesitant to go. She seemingly doesn't want to. Emily's initial response is, "Oh, of course you're going to go. Why would you not go?" And Lorelai's response is, "Well, she doesn't have to if she doesn't want to. Let's talk to Rory about what she wants here." And then there's the whole conversation with Rory about why Rory is hesitant to go. There's a lot that we can break down there too. But I want to start with, what do you think about Emily's response to Rory not wanting to go to this formal versus Lorelai's response to her not wanting to go, and how they both confront Rory about it?
I definitely think that Lorelai had the right approach there and was also right to tell Emily, like, hey, she's old enough to make this decision for herself. And if she doesn't want to go, she doesn't have to go. I'm, going to defer to her desires and judgments, because Lorelai values independence and free thought and, just autonomy, doing what you want. And she wants to instill that in Rory. She wants to make sure that Rory doesn't feel the same pressures from her that she felt from her own mom, so that Rory can become her own person. And the funny thing about that is that I think it sort of unexpectedly leads Rory to absorb more of Lorelai's personality than anyone anticipated, because she spends so much time with her mom that she just starts to absorb her mom's personality traits and her mom's feelings and beliefs. Like, even Dean calls her out on it. Like, are you going to ask your mom? Or are you going to make one of your pro-con lists? Like, everyone can tell that Rory is so deferential to her mom's ways and opinions that sometimes she has a hard time splitting off from what her mom will think or what her mom will say. And yeah, I think Lorelai was right to have that conversation with her in the car and encourage her and be like, I don't want you to miss out on anything because you're too shy or you're scared that these people won't accept you.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, it's up to you. You can go or you can not go. What about you?
Yeah.
Do you like that?
I love Lorelai's response, and it's so night and day from Emily's, where Emily's not even willing to make a conversation out of it. She's just like, well, of course you're going to go to the formal because that's what's expected of you. You should go. This is your school. This is your education. It's a social engagement that you should be present at. And she doesn't take the time to have the conversation with Rory that Lorelai does, where she's like, hey, and I love that moment where Lorelai says, if you don't want to go because you genuinely don't want to go, this conversation ends here and now, and I will never bring it up ever again. But if you're not going because you're too shy or you're too scared or because you've been on the receiving end of too much bullying at school and you're worried about what your peers are going to think, or another reason that she brings up is because you know that I'm not a fan of dances and these sort of things, so therefore you think that you shouldn't be. Like, don't follow in my footsteps if this is something that you really want to do, but let's talk about why you're hesitant here. And Lorelai's willing to have that conversation with her where Emily's just so dismissive. And it is a beautiful moment because it allows Rory to open up and say, like, yes, I am potentially worried about what you are going to think if I want to go, if you're going to disapprove as my mother. I'm worried about me just ending up going to this dance, being in the back of the room, like a wallflower, not having anyone to talk to. I'm also worried that my boyfriend is going to say no, that he doesn't want to go. So I have quite a few reservations about why I'm hesitant to even pursue this, but Lorelai encourages her. And I think that's it's a very big differential between how Emily approached it and how Lorelai approached it.
Yeah, it's a really early example of how Lorelai's parenting is healthier and does encourage Rory to differentiate from her. Although there are sometimes when Rory tries to differentiate a little too much and Lorelai gets scared and possessive, basically, which is less healthy. But let's talk a little bit more. I promised this in a previous plug for the next episode, that we would really like go into depth about that, the fight scene at the end of Rory's dance, where Dean and Rory have accidentally been out all night, and Emily wakes up to find Rory hasn't returned yet, and she starts freaking out. And she and Lorelai really have it out in the kitchen. Any takeaways from that scene that you want to touch on?
Yeah, it was just an instant almost flashback and burn for Emily of just like, oh my gosh, Rory is literally about to make the exact same mistake that Lorelai did. And in Emily's mind, she's not willing to consider Rory as her own individual or her own person. She's just seeing her as, oh my gosh, this is Lorelai 2.0. She's staying out with a boy all night again. She's about to get pregnant, make the exact same mistake. And they have it out in the kitchen. And Lorelai has to tell her, like, no, like, Rory's not me. She's not going to get pregnant. She's not going to make that same mistake. But Emily just knee-jerked, like, reacted and flashed back to, oh my gosh, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, circle of life, like this exact same thing is about to play out again. And I think Lorelai was good to defend Rory in that moment and realize, like, yes, she is her own person. But then when Rory eventually walks in the door, Emily leaves and then walks into the kitchen, and Lorelai turns on her and starts yelling at her. Lorelai becomes Emily in that moment. And I hated it because it's like you're trying so hard to not be your mother, but you turn and you round on your daughter in the same way that you wouldn't have wanted your own mother to just come at you about an error in judgment. So you're not, it's not a moment of breaking the mold where you're also acting like Emily would have. And Rory recognizes it and she says, this is really unfair. You know, I didn't do anything, but you're treating me in the exact same way.
Yeah. Something that stands out to me about it is that Lorelai says to Rory, "Do you have any idea what it's like to wake up with my mother here to find out you never came home?" And Rory calls her out about like, "So this is all about what grandma thinks?" Because it's like,
Mm-hmm.
Lorelai likes to say, the only thing that matters is like what Rory thinks and what I think. And so she tries to disregard Emily's thoughts and feelings a lot of the time when it comes to stuff like this. And this is a moment where she does sort of have some of that Emily-like reaction. But part of her reaction being quite so negative is not just what happened, but the fact that Emily was there to see it and that this has caused strife with them
Mm-hmm.
and has dug up all these feelings about the past and about Lorelai deviating from the path that they set out for her. So I thought it was just really interesting that she sort of like phrases it that way. And, you know, what it's like to wake up with my mother here, because it just
Mm-hmm.
compounds the problem and makes it worse and triggers Emily. And now Lorelai has to deal with that. And so it causes her to go into this sort of like fight mode instead of being able to rationalize and listen and stop and listen to Rory when she says, "Nothing happened. It was an accident. You can trust me. I swear to you that nothing like you think happened." So I thought
Mm-hmm.
that was kind of an interesting takeaway from that. And the other thing that like sticks out is the fact that she's like, "You're going on the pill. You're not getting pregnant." And it makes me wonder, like, is it just a pragmatic feeling on Lorelai's part where it's like, I know abstinence only doesn't work. I know what I was like as a teenager. It's better to be safe than sorry and to just get her on the pill? Or is it like, is it harkening back to something that Lorelai wishes she'd had access to as a teenager and was like, maybe if I'd had this, my life would be very different right now and I wouldn't be standing in this kitchen having this conversation? Like, what do you make of the fact that she wanted Roy to go on the pill, but that they didn't actually end up going through with that seemingly?
Yeah. Again, I think that Lorelai needed to trust Rory in that moment when she says nothing happened, and you can bank on me here. Like, I'm not. Rory didn't outrightly say it, and because it would have been taken the wrong way. But I think Rory was also trying to say, like, I'm not about to make the same mistake that you did. So this is not a conversation that we need to have. You need to be a little bit more trustful here. But Lorelai's not able to do so, and I don't even think it's that she can't. I think again, it's just Emily's presence triggered Lorelai so much that she had to go to Rory and say, "You're going on the pill. I can't let this happen to you because my own like, what is Emily going to think potentially?" And it's like, well, it's not about her. So I think it wasn't only necessarily about Lorelai thinking like abstinence only is the solution. I think that she knows and anticipates that at some point her daughter is going to be sexually active whenever that happens. But I don't think it was about preventing pregnancy so much as it was also about just how, at the end of the day, if Rory were to get pregnant as a teenager, how Lorelai would look to Emily. And I think that was also one of her fears. And you want to talk generational trauma? Like, that's just emotional scarring, and where you're not even concerned about your own daughter's well-being and a potential pregnancy, where you're just concerned about how you're going to look to your mother at the end of the day. And I think that was just a very vehement takeaway that wasn't necessarily good for Rory. But Rory picks up on it, and she's like, none of this is fair right now with how you're treating me, and you're only talking to me and scolding me in this way because you're just mad that grandma was here and came down on you for this and had to see it. So goodbye, I'm going into my room.
Mm-hmm. And it took them days to end that fight. Yeah. Yeah. This is one of those podcasts that I've prepped for like too much. I'm very much Rory in the way I like to prepare for things. And I have like dozens of pages of notes. And I feel like we've been talking for an hour and we've hardly scratched the surface with so much of like the Emily, Lorelai, Rory dynamic. So we will have to save some of that stuff for future podcasts. Like maybe we'll do Generational Trauma 2 Electric Boogaloo sometime in the future
Mm-hmm.
because we have to move on. Because I do want
Yep.
to talk a little bit more about Christopher and how he factors into all of this, because there is a great moment with him that I definitely want to touch on in season 5, after Strobe dies, while Strobe is sick, I suppose, he comes to Rory at Yale and tries to make amends with her after, she's come to him passive aggressively and says, I don't want you interfering with mom. I don't want you contacting her. If you need something, call someone else, anyone else. But mom is happy, and I do not want you messing things up this time. And, Christopher stuck to that. But Lorelai was the one who reached out and tried to make sure he was okay with Gigi. And Rory got, again, passive aggressively angry about it. Generational trauma. All of the Gilmore women are extremely passive aggressive, but we'll have to touch on that more at some other point too. But yeah, so Chris comes and tries to repair things after that situation and says, my dad's not doing well. I've been in Hartford with my family, and he and I always had this emotional wall, and I don't want to have that with you because it sucks. And I know I put it there, but I don't want it there. I want you to want to see me. Like, what can I do to make this better? And, so Chris has his own generational traumas that are completely separate from the Gilmore issues that also have a bearing on Rory.
Yeah. Do you think, I don't know, it feels, it always felt to me like it was too little too late. You had the better part of almost 2 decades at this point to try and repair a relationship with Rory. And I think that, yes, perhaps in her early years and her, most formative toddler, elementary school education level years, if Lorelai didn't necessarily want you there all the time or as present in her life, I don't know, there's such a gray area there with, do you respect that or do you push on it and say like, no, I have a right to be present as her father? But Christopher's coming to this party really late. And I think he's trying to, build back up, these connections with Rory after too much time has passed.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because, something you said made me think of It Should Have Been Lorelai, where Emily again tries to blame Lorelai for something that's not her fault, wherein she said, Christopher was willing to marry you when you got pregnant and you said no. Like, you've always kept him at arm's length. You've always kept everyone at arm's length. If you had just married him, maybe he would have gotten his stuff together and he would have gotten it together with you and you would be a happy family right now. Instead, he's with this other woman who's now trying to worm her way into your life. And Lorelai's like, don't put that on me, mother. And then she goes ahead and tells Chris what epiphany she's had about the fact that she's always sort of been waiting for him to get his stuff together so that they could really so that he could be there for her and for Rory. And so it's a thing where she doesn't necessarily understand the impact she might have had on him had she asked for more from him when Rory was younger. She might have had a maturing effect on him. And she doesn't realize that because she was just so concerned with being independent and not relying on anyone that she kept him out. And so I think maybe if he'd been given a chance sooner, like you say, too little, too late. But I think Lorelai was a big part of that. It's not like Christopher never tried to either be a part of Rory's life or a part of Lorelai's life. He asked Lorelai to marry him multiple times before this. And she shuts him out at every turn. And maybe if he'd been, granted more of an inside track on their lives, he would have felt more connected and been able to maintain that connection better. I mean, maybe not. Maybe he was so emotionally stunted from his upbringing. We see Strobe and Francine are very much like Emily and Richard. And so he probably had a very similar upbringing where they were completely distant and did not teach him the right ways to process his feelings either. And we see how immature he is in season 7 when he and Lorelai are in a relationship and how he just runs from everything. So he might have run from Rory at any given time when things got too intense. So it's a little bit of some from column A, some from column B. Like, I don't know that it was too little too late because he has at least tried to make an effort, especially as he got his life more together in his 30s. But I also need to call him out on the fact that, and this is not the first time this happens in the show, but call him out on the fact that he only has this sort of like emotional epiphany and this desire to repair the bridge in the light of a tragedy. Like a crisis makes people realize what they should be, like how they should be engaging emotionally with their family. And it's sad to see that like it takes such extreme measures and terrible things happening for people to have these moments of clarity of what's really important to them in their relationships. So, and going back to what you said earlier about Rory's pregnancy and going to Christopher in the revival, I think that's part of it. Like he says to her, you know, you and your mom were always destined, and there was really nothing I could do about it. Like the minute she saw you, it was over. And how could I live up to that? How could I compete? So I just stepped back. And I wonder if that's going to have an impact on Rory as she goes forward with her child, and whether she's going to do what her mom did by shutting Logan out, or whether she's going to be like, I know what happened to me when my mom didn't want help, didn't want to include Christopher, didn't want to include my grandparents. And I don't want that to be the same for my kid because it made things difficult for me growing up. So, like, do you think that's the direction? Like, if they did another revival, do you think that that's the direction that Rory would go? And do you think that's the right thing for her to do? Do you like the narrative choice of Lorelai following in her mom's footsteps and deciding to do it on her own? Or do you wish that she would break the mold and invite the father in so that the child has input from both parents? That's hopefully an improvement on what they got from their parents, because Logan's parents are also a piece of work. But
yeah. Oh gosh. We'll get again November 2025.
Yeah.
We'll get to them eventually. There's a lot there that you asked. Do I want her to break the mold? Yes. Do I want her to involve Logan in her child's life? Because again, we're not explicitly told who the father is, but you and I think definitively both agree that we think that it's his. So do I want to, if we ever get a revival, see her involve Logan in her child's life? 1,000% yes across the board. I would like to see him step into the role of a father figure. I do want to see Rory involve him. I think it's beneficial for the child. I think it's also going to be beneficial for Rory to have the support system there of a partner, even if it's not someone that you're with. Do I think it's going to happen that way? If we do get a revival? No. And that makes me sad. Because that's what I would want to see. But I do see this again going for full circle, and Rory just walking down the same path her mother did, where she's like, I'm just going to raise this child as a single mother by myself. And I will have the support of Lorelai, and I'll have the support of Stars Hollow and a wonderful community of friends. I'm sure Suki and Jackson will be there for her. You know, Lane will be there for her. She will have a network in place of people who are going to help her raise this kid and be there for her when she requires assistance. But I do see it being written where, yeah, she is going to raise this child again alone, absent of a father figure, and not include Logan. And that's not what I want to see, but I do think that's how it would play out. And I don't agree that it's right.
Yeah, I find it really interesting when people like to compare Lorelai's and Rory's relationships and say, like, Logan is her Christopher and Jess is her Luke. I'm like, that feels too deterministic to me. And yes, the show is about where you lead, I will follow, and these sort of, like I said at the beginning, generational traumas and curses, and patterns repeating themselves. But you also see, like I've said, some of those patterns being broken. And this is one where I really do want to see that, because Logan is not Christopher, I think. And especially because we're in the revival now where these characters are in their 30s instead of their late teens, you know, Logan is not going to have the same response to the, like, finding out Rory is pregnant as Christopher would have had to Lorelai. And I think that he'll be a lot more insistent upon being in that child's life, and probably also trying to be a better dad than his dad was to him. I think he wants maybe a chance at that. And Jess is also very different from Luke. I don't think Jess maybe has it in him to be to Rory what Luke is to Lorelai. And so I don't like it when people are like, well, she's obviously going to end up with Jess because Lorelai ended up with Luke. And I'm like, that's
no.
Like, I know it has like a nice narrative ring to it, but that's also like just a really bad narrative cop-out where it feels too much like predestination or predetermination, and it completely removes, character individualities and, differences in situation. So I really hope that they don't do that, and that, even if Logan kind of gets trapped in his relationship with Odette and isn't able to leave her to be with Rory, to be a real full-time dad, I hope that there's some sort of compromise found where it's not just 32-year-old Rory is pregnant, unwed, no job, no future, no path, stuck in Stars Hollow with a baby at the age of 32. Like, it just feels sad for her to follow in her mom's footsteps, but to have it be, after this sort of like build her up through the series to have this like amazing career, and then in the revival they just cut her right back down to having basically nothing, to being back home with mommy, to having financial struggles, to being single. And well, actually she's not single, she's just extremely inconsiderate to her boyfriend. And
Rory never does that.
Yeah, Rory is an angel. She belongs on a Christmas tree. More on that next week. So yeah, I think it's a lot sadder for her to end up like her mom, given where the story has gone. Whereas, when Lorelai did it at 17, she made a life for herself. She really like stepped up to the plate and parented Rory, got a job, made it work, eventually earned the life that we see them have throughout the series. And Rory feels like it was the opposite trajectory. Lorelai was like this, slow and steady and up, and Rory was like up, 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 whoa. And yeah, so I really just don't want to see that pattern repeat itself. I think it would be nice to see Rory having Logan more involved, maybe for him to leave. I would love for him to leave Odette. I am team Logan. I want him to be like, I do not love her. I do not want to trap her in a loveless marriage. I'm in love with Rory. We will fight this out in Battle of the Boyfriends. Get out of that relationship that your parents want you to have because it's the dynastic plan, and marry the person that you actually love, and, be a father to your child in a way that like her dad was never a part of her life. So that's what I want.
Well, okay, but Logan did propose to Rory. She said no. So just because she's
she
pregnant
was 22.
now, yeah, okay, but just because she's pregnant now, is she going to all of a sudden agree to a marriage for the sake of a child? I don't know if she would do that. Like,
I mean, you make a good point about the where you lead, I will follow on that, because that's exactly what they were trying to do with Lorelai and Christopher. But the difference here is that when Rory turned down Logan's proposal, she said, it's really great, and I could see being married to you. I like the idea of this, but, right now my whole life is ahead of me. And if I married you, like all of my decisions would be made for me. But now she's at a much different place in her life where she's gone out into the world and started her career and has more of a sense of where she's at. And she's struggled with it. And so she's in a bad place with it at the time of the revival. But
yeah,
it's not the same as saying no to getting married so young. Now she's in her 30s. She's about to become a mother. She has different priorities at this stage in her life. And maybe it would be a reconsideration for her, considering how attached she clearly is to this man and what a life with him might actually look like at this stage in her life.
I agree. But again, he would, if that's going to happen, he has to leave Odette. that relationship needs to end and you need to step into a new relationship and or marriage with Rory as a father figure. And I mean, even if he, like, again, this is its own conversation and not something that we need to touch on too much here, but even if he's not willing to do that, like, what is Odette's reaction going to be like when all of a sudden he's still staying in a relationship with you, but is stepping into a father figure role with a child that is not yours? Like,
that's going to be
if
a
I
really
was Odette,
interesting
like, I don't,
conversation.
yeah, like, how do you approach that, like, conversation with her saying, like, oh, hey, like, I still want you and I to get married, but there's
But
this
I've got a
girl that
side
I've known
piece who's
since
pregnant.
there's this girl that I've known since college. We've kind of always just had this thing going on. Oh, by the way, she's having my child. Like, what does Odette do? Like,
And
who knows? But again,
yeah, we don't know Odette. So she might be of the mind of like, I don't care what you do outside of this, as long as our marriage looks good and shiny to the outside world. Like, this is the dynastic plan. I'll go forward with it if you'll go forward with it. That could be the arrangement. But,
maybe.
if she actually does have the real feelings for him, finding out that he's been cheating on her for a prolonged period is not going to be a pleasant revelation for her. So that's going to be a really interesting thing to find out if they ever do another revival. And that's another reason why I hope that he leaves her, because it's clear that, he hasn't done right by her and that his heart lies with Rory. And so at least if they're going to be together, like, there's it keeps them away from other people. It like doesn't bring other people into their mess that they've now created for themselves with this.
Yep. So I think the solution is clear. We just need a revival to have all of these questions answered. Amy,
Yes.
Lauren, Alexis, Scott,
Maisel
everybody.
is over. Yeah, like,
let's get on it. Just get on it.
the fans are clamoring, literally. They
We
keep
all
talking
want these
about
questions.
it.
Yep.
I keep seeing to this day, people trying to find hints of a second revival in anything that they can, and I'm really hoping
I am
at
seeing it
this
on a
point.
daily basis at this point.
Yeah.
Yep. We're approaching 2023. I see it every day. I really do.
Yeah.
So
It'll be interesting
save it.
because Rory's, I'm presuming it will probably be a daughter, unless Amy really wants to
No,
break the
okay.
mold.
It is a girl. Rory, Amy confirmed this. We'll have to talk about that. But
Oh.
yes,
Well, why am I
spoiler
not surprised?
again for spoiler potentially for you and for anyone else watching this, but it was confirmed in a recent conversation that Amy had that Rory is pregnant with a girl.
That doesn't surprise me. So they have two options. They could either sort of set it immediately after the other one and just pretend that nobody is aged, which I could live with. Most of them are ageless beauties anyway. Um, or they could jump ahead and have Rory with like a 6-year-old, which would be interesting. So I'm excited to see where they'll go with it if they have another one. But we're getting a bit of ahead of ourselves here. I want to pull it back to the actual conversation at hand and talk about one more interesting dynamic that I think has a lot of parallels with sort of our main characters, and that's Lane and Mrs. Kim.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
We'll have to rein this in because we could literally talk for another hour or two, I feel like, just on them and their relationship and traumas there. But
we're
wow,
we're definitely
where do you even want to start with that?
It's an interesting one. Like, we will get more into it when we do like our Lane deep dive, and I'm sure she'll come up in other conversations as well. But I think a good place to start is sort of like to connect her to Lorelai a little bit and sort of appreciate how much her upbringing is probably similar to what Lorelai faced, except the difference being Lorelai's mom always tried to control her, like strictly for a desire for control, in terms of like, I'm going to keep you on this path and you're going to slot into this lifestyle because that's the only appropriate thing for you given our station in life. Whereas Mrs. Kim is strict and controlling because she really cares for Lane, and she has these ideas about, like, she still has these ideas about what the right path is, but they seem to stem almost more from anxiety about boys, mostly, pigs of filth, corrupting her daughter. A lot of her
boys.
Yeah. A lot of her ideas and beliefs come more from a religious standpoint, which is interesting because she was raised a Buddhist. Her mom's a Buddhist, and she split away from her own mom to have her own life in the US and become a Seventh-day Adventist and brought Lane up under those strictures, which, was oppressive. And you saw how Lane tried to rebel against that. And you can imagine Lorelai being a lot like that and maybe having her own version of the closet and the floorboards. And yeah, so it's very different backgrounds and locuses of control, I guess, in terms of like where their parents were coming from and how they were raised. But the result was the same. And then you see this beautiful moment, one of my favorites. I believe it's after Double Date, when Lorelai goes to Mrs. Kim and says, like, look, Lane is great, but maybe you need to like loosen up just a little bit because, if someone had given me some air when I was younger, maybe things would have turned out differently for me because I was really unhappy with that much control. And, sort of the undertone of it was like, if you're too harsh on Lane, she's going to rebel against you. And that's not what you want, because I can tell that she respects you and she just wants to make you happy. But if you're going to be this harsh on her, you might have to pay for this later. And she does, in The Clamor and the Clangor, we really see the peak of Lane's rebellion against her mom and her trying to like carve out her own identity and be herself. And it's just so hard for her to try to please her mom and please herself at the same time. And Lorelai recognizes that tension within her and tries to help them. And I love that in season 7 for Lane's baby shower, we get the episode is called Will You Be My Lorelai Gilmore? So she recognizes that, having that sort of like emotional buffer and someone who can bridge the gap between parent and child to make sure that these generational traumas don't perpetuate.
Yeah. I mean, I will say too, Mrs. Kim course corrected when she could. It took her some time to do so. It didn't happen overnight, but she was able to. And I just think of the moment where she finds, Lane's closet and realizes what she has going on beneath the floorboards, which I don't know how she didn't find some of that before. But that's neither here nor there. But even when you see in those moments just the despair that Mrs. Kim has of not knowing her daughter and not knowing where her interests really lied, but also just realizing that her own daughter was hiding all of these own things from her because she was just so afraid of how her own mother was going to react and the wedge that it would drive. And I think in those moments, she's able to realize that what Lorelai is saying is correct. If you're not willing to get to know your daughter better and recognize these things, she's going to bolt, she's going to run, you're going to have to pay for that later. And you are right that she does. There are multiple instances of that. But it was heartbreaking for me to see Mrs. Kim having to reckon with that and just how it relates to the path that she probably had with her own mother. I'm sure Mrs. Kim's mother was very harsh and strict on her in the same way that she was with Lane. And so it's just, she reckons with it. And then I love seeing her course correct. And eventually she is able to get on board with, Lane wanting to be a drummer and a musician and a part of this band and raise her own children in a different way, but still be a supportive figure within their lives. And she is a supportive grandmother to Lane's twin boys. So she adjusts and she does better. And that's not always something that we get within the generations of, the Gilmore women that we see. Not everyone always does better, but Mrs. Kim does.
Yeah, Emily's a little too rigid in her beliefs and ideas, whereas Mrs. Kim is able to still hold on to those ideas, but also recognize that her daughter holds different beliefs than she does, and she finds a way to compromise with her, whether it's explicitly like in Will You Be My Lorelai Gilmore, where they literally have like a back and forth negotiation about how often the twins will go to church and whether they'll eat seafood or shrimp or whatever. Like those explicit negotiations versus just her acceptance of her bandmates and her choices in life in terms of like who to marry and what he wants to do with his life. The potential husband for her daughter is not what she expected at all, and yet she finds a way to embrace him and come to understand Lane better through that process. So it's sort of like what we would have hoped for from Emily, and it gives us a window into what it looks like to try to repair those relationships. Like we get a lot of I find a lot of media these days features estrangement with parents because it's becoming more common for people to do it. We're starting to understand better what these generational traumas look like and starting to understand that it might be acceptable for us to cut ties with people who are not good for us, including members of our family. Whereas before, like the family was the sacred unit that could not be sundered, right? And Gilmore Girls sort of, despite the fact that, this is a more recent phenomenon and this predates a lot of that, it sort of reverses it where the estrangement has already happened and we just take it as fact at the beginning. But then we see them attempt at reconciliation and reconnection after estrangement. And we get to see the struggles that people go through when they try to make amends after a family has sort of like fallen apart because of the behavior of particular members within that family. And so I think it's really interesting how we get to see these characters contend with, trying to overcome these differences in values and beliefs and find this middle ground where they can move forward in a healthier way with their families.
What is your overall takeaway in terms of whether it's with Mrs. Kim and Lane, whether it's with Trix and Emily, Emily and Lorelai, Lorelai and Rory? What's your overall takeaway on how to best parent a child and be just emotionally present for them and raise them up the best way that you can?
Wow, that is a huge question. We'll probably have to do like an entire episode of that because, wow, like how best to parent a child, like there are hundreds of books out there about how
That's
best to
true.
do it. So I'm just going to try to keep this short and sweet and say, I think the best thing you can do is just try to be there and be sensitive to a
And yeah, I
child's
guess like
needs.
any shining examples.
Yeah, shining examples. I mean, I haven't prepared for this. So actually some of the best examples I would say are shockingly between Lorelai and Lane. Kind of going back to that last moment where Lorelai recognizes herself in Lane, and you see it, when she goes to comfort her in Love and War and Snow after she's run her fingers through Rich Blumenfeld's hair, and she's just able to be sensitive to how Lane feels, and is also able to give her good advice in that moment. And so I think anytime you see Lorelai really understanding what Rory is going through and trying to provide her with validation and support, like those are really important. You have to like understand that even independent kids who are smart and competent, like they still need emotional connection. They still need attention, and just be sensitive to your kids and let them be their own people and recognize that they will have separate beliefs and attitudes and actions and whatever from you, and that's okay, that they don't have to exactly fit whatever role you think they should. Like trying to pigeonhole your kid and put them in a box from day one is like the worst thing you can do. You just need to like let their personalities unfold and listen to them about what they want and try to help them achieve their own goals, because that's the only way that they're going to become fully formed people who are able to have a strong sense of self.
I agree to all of that. I
Anything
couldn't have said
anything
it
to
better
add to
myself.
that?
Nope, just like just don't do that to your kid. Like they will resent you for it. It just really hinders their emotional growth. There are so many dangerous repercussions that can come of just not allowing your child to grow into the person that they aspire and want to be themselves. So let them be who they are and just be there for them and support them every step of the way. We didn't see that happen enough in this show, and we see our characters suffer for it. And that would be my takeaway. Just don't do that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it up because we've been talking for an hour and a half, and we could keep going on this for ages. There's so much material on this, and I'm gonna have to, borrow out of my notes from this for future episodes because I had way too much good stuff that like is really, really interesting to talk about. So stay tuned for unused notes. But yeah, next week we have a more relaxed, fun holiday stream plan, and we're going to talk about all the Christmas episodes of the show, and have some candy cane coffee and get all decked out in the holiday spirit.
Yep, join us for that. We, again, we're not necessarily breaking for the holidays. We will still be here with you Friday for dinner. So come hang out with us for that. But in the meantime, go back and check out some of the episodes we've already done if you're just needing content and want more Gilmore Girls in the meantime. You can also check us out on social media. We have an Instagram, we have a Twitter. Links to those accounts can be found in the description below. And just do all of the basic YouTube things. Please just like this video, subscribe to our channel. That helps us out most, and we really appreciate your support. In the meantime, though, that being said, cheers. Get into the holiday spirit because we're getting close, folks. And however however you're celebrating, just enjoy the season. And we'll see you next Friday night for dinner.
Bye.
Ciao.